All right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to Designing Role-Playing Games That Don't Center Violence. My name is Ash Kreider. My pronouns are they, them, and things that you might know me from are I am one of the co-designers of The Watch, and also a number of LARPs like The Straights Are Not Okay. And I will throw things over to my fellow co-panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Jeeyon.
Thank you, Ash. My name is Jeeyon Shim. I actually got my start in games at METATOPIA in 2017. My pronouns are she, her, and you might know me from a recent Kickstarter called Wait For Me that I co-designed with Kevin Culp. It's a journaling game about time traveling for your own personal history, and I've also done a lot of independent design here and there, including collaborating with Jason Morningstar. Jason, you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jeeyon. Yeah, I'm Jason Morningstar, and my pronouns are he, him. I'm the creative director at Bully Pulpit Games, and you might know me from games like Fiasco and Night Witches. And I will pass it over to our other panelist, Mike.
Hello, my name is Mike Czaplinski, he, him. Some of you out there may recognize me and know me as Croc because I used to do security at various double exposure conventions. And although I have had a couple of scenarios published, I'm actually coming at this more from the consumer side, shall we say, or the homemade side, because I've been dabbling in doing games for kids, and I've had some interesting realizations that I think might be valuable. At least I hope they are. So, Next.
Awesome. Well, just a little bit about why I pitched this panel in the first place. This is actually a panel that I've done twice at other conventions that I think has only gotten more relevant. It's an issue that I started becoming aware of when I was working on The Watch, given the reactions that people would have to that when they found out that there was no mechanic for interpersonal violence. And I kept having interactions always with AMAB people who told me that that was a problem. And I began to realize that it's really designing games that don't center violence and that don't even have a mechanic for it is seen as a very niche area of game design, especially if you're not designing games for kids. And I started to wonder, why do we have this collective limitation on the stories that we use role-playing to tell? Why is it considered such a niche thing? And especially, why are there some people who believe that it's actually a problem when a game doesn't have this kind of mechanic? So that's why I pitched this panel, and I'm super excited to talk to my co-panelists about this because I think they're all doing very interesting things about this topic. So, yeah.
Can you tell me what the AMAB is an acronym for?
Sorry, assigned male at birth. So it was just something that I noticed that it was all cis dudes who were expressing this sentiment that if someone said it is a problem that your game does not have do violence to a person rule, they were always a cis dude. So, Jeeyon, you had said that there was something there was something about this topic that particularly spoke to you in our conversation beforehand.
Yeah, I can totally talk about it now. One of the things that struck me as I was thinking about this panel and specifically seeing the response to it, because it seemed like it got a lot of interest when I was talking about it on Twitter, was how we think about violence and talk about violence, and how I realized that as the only non-white person on this panel, I might actually be talking about something different. Because for me, violence isn't just combat oriented or interpersonal physical violence or even just interpersonal emotional violence. It's also the impact and ripple effect of white settler colonialism to me is inherently violent. So for example, I'm designing a game with a friend of mine who's an incredible artist and experienced designer, Shin Kor. It's a journaling game called Field Guide to Memory, and it's about cryptids, which involves a lot of exploration and scientific names and stuff like that, and doing the research, there's like a big brouhaha going on in the birding society about taxonomic names that were given by European settlers and explorers to animals and plants that already have indigenous names or local names. And that's an act of violence, right? And so none of my games really have combat intrinsically in them, but also that's something that the other aspect of it, the framework of whiteness as kind of like inherently violent if you are not a white player or designer, is something that I kind of always have in the back of my mind, but it doesn't necessarily become front and center. And so that's just something I wanted to make a little time to say explicitly, because the way that I talk about my design might be different than other panelists or other designers in the field.
Yeah, that's a super good point. So thank you very much for bringing that up. You know, that I think that certainly resonates with my experience of recently, you know, being a non-binary trans person. A lot of my game design the last several years has revolved around exploring, you know, the kind of binary colonization is not the correct word, but I'm very tired. You know, colonization of you know, gender that happens in everyone's brains, and so definitely, I obviously can't understand your experience as you know, a visible minority, but you know, it feels resonant to me with my experience of gender in the games that I have been writing recently, as part of, you know, I want to write nonviolent games, have explicitly featured, I'm just writing characters that are explicitly, if you play this character, they're, congratulations, you're non-binary. It's not an option. So.
Hey, Jeeyon, your comments make me think about sort of the historic origins of the hobby as well, right? We're talking about games that were certainly predicated on like the projection of power, you know, conflict and adversarial interaction.
It was called wargaming for many, many years before people, you know, before the Dungeons and Dragons matured into its own thing.
And so exactly. And so like in the same way that it's easy to center a colonial narrative, and I acknowledge the implicit violence in that, the games that spawned the games that we play are coming out of that tradition as well. So it's not necessarily just like a historical phenomenon or a sociocultural phenomenon. Like the games are hard coded to support that worldview, or at least they were for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh no, it's one of the things that I've been thinking about, because again, I've been doing games for kids. A friend of mine wanted to run more D&D for his extraordinarily precocious, at the time 10, now 12-year-old daughter and her friends. And I mean, she's precocious and she's wonderful and she's been playing a lot of D&D, but she's 12 and she's 10. So writing games for her and her friends, I had to think of things other than just combat, the way I ended up approaching it was, I like action in games. Historically, the easiest action to model mechanically has been violence. It starts with wargaming, and it's gone through Dungeons and Dragons and all the other iterations, at least that I've seen, and I've played a lot of games over the years. And it took me getting in my head to decouple violence from action. That's helped me do things that are more like cartoons, because cartoons can have action and not violence. And also Animal Planet documentaries about hunting animals, you know, like Crocodile Hunter, or shows where people stalk animals. Those can be just as intense as anything in, say, a war movie or a crime drama. And again, I've been sticking to Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition for a variety of reasons. The mechanical system that they have for that is now not just a combat system, it's a task resolution system. And you have to think when you're making a scenario in ways other than violence. You're overcoming a challenge, whether it's a physical obstacle, or talking to another character. If they're either the character's talking to an NPC that you're playing as the dungeon master, or moderating the discussions that happen between the players. And that's part of your job, is to make players understand that you don't always have to hit things. You can think of other ways.
I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and that's why I'm increasingly interested in, what's happening in the indie space. Not to
I understand.
Not to yuck anyone's yum, but what I have experienced as someone who's been designing games for a long time now, is, players will do what the mechanics are. So whatever mechanics you give them, that's what will happen. So in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, where you have hundreds of pages of how to do violence to a person, and maybe 5 of how to not do violence to a person, making that kind of change takes a lot of work on the person running the game, and also a lot of explicit social contract with the players. Whereas I almost feel like it can be easier in, the indie space to be more mindful of, if I don't want my players to do a thing, I'm not going to give them a mechanic.
True, but at the same time, people like to break stuff, and one of the reasons that. Oh, sorry, John.
Oh, no. Please. I love to hear the complete thought.
You're absolutely correct. Even though 5th edition, which is my personal favorite of all, and I've been playing it since I've been playing since 1979. So I started playing D&D when it was just the Monster Manual and the Player's Handbook. The DM's Guide hadn't even come out. And one of the things that I love about the way the game has progressed mechanically was making everything just overcoming a challenge, whether that's combat. But having said that, and even though 5th edition has a lot more robust non-combat stuff, you're absolutely correct. The vast majority of the mechanics of the game are geared towards inflicting hit point damage.
Mm-hmm.
But whether it was conscious or not, the way they've made their task resolution system, you can extend it. And again, I'm sticking to 5th edition because my focus is more writing stuff that I can run for kids and their parents and my friends. But
yeah,
I'm impressed. I'm very impressed, by things like Fate. I mean, I love Fate because Fate for me is a good bridge between the crunchy stuff that I'm habitually used to and the concept of other stuff.
Sorry to cut you off. I'm just mindful that we only have a limited amount of time, and Jeeyon had wanted to.
My thought is finished, so please.
Yeah, I actually, it's interesting because I have a background that I think actually touches on stuff that you're both saying, right? Both about how when you design for anyone, especially kids, they tend to, as you said, want to break stuff. And also the thing you said, Ash, about if you don't want something in the game, don't put the mechanics in there for it, is just like, it synthesized my old job, which was for 6 years. I worked as an outdoor educator who taught wilderness survival skills to kids through LARPing. And I did the program coordination for it. I took over the role about 2 years into my time at that company. And, very quickly, like teaching kids outside, if they pick up a stick, they might start with a fort, they might, do creative stuff with it. At some point, though, it becomes a sword or a gun, right? Like kids want to play out the things that they see, including their sense of adventure. And this is kind of what I meant about like colonialism is violence, right? Like even something like exploration. Exploration is adventure, it's discovery, it's exciting. And also, what does that mean in a framework and a cultural shared history where a lot of exploration for huge demographics of people means devastation and the destruction of their way of life? An 8-year-old is not going to be thinking about that. And honestly, as a designer, I don't think it's always appropriate to like write into a game, by the way, these activities you love draw from a genocidal background. Like they're kids, right? But there's still ways that you can incentivize other kinds of play. And so, for example, when I took over the program coordinator and designer role there, it was a given that at the end of every week of summer camp, there would be this huge battle, and it was awesome. They were fun, but there were always some kids who didn't want to do it, and it was a logistical nightmare. So like for me, because I love making my life easier, I started shifting things into like, okay, each staff instructor would look at their group and be like, what do you want to do with your kids? What do your kids want to do? And what came out of that was a more intense combat mechanic system around healing. The druids started doing things like, in order to heal someone, you had to actually find a plant in the wild that had real healing powers, like touch it and then touch the person you were healing. They learned about physical consent. You always had to ask permission before you touched someone's arm or hand. They also like would sometimes act as like literal physical boundaries between a kid who was really scared because someone was coming at them with like a sword and the person running toward them. And it was always a given that if like a druid cast a ward, the combatant had to back off, like no matter what. And this is an artificial space because it's children playing supervised by adults, but those principles have absolutely held in my design work, and also importantly, my facilitation work with adults who, again, like grew up in a culture where adventure equals exploration and violence, right? And I think it's totally doable as long as you remain open to the idea that, as you were saying, Mike, like you have to think of other things as equally exciting. How do we as designers get players to the point where they're thinking of something like finding plantain herb in this mown lawn just as exciting as like wailing on somebody with a foam sword, right? It can be done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's yeah, I just, what that makes me think, Jeeyon, when you say that, is that the whole idea of conflict is really a designable surface, right? That we have the ability to, I mean, we're creating an experience. We can tune that in ways that are going to be mutually beneficial, that are going to be that are going to promote whatever values we espouse, right? So, like, I was hearing that, I'm like, you managed to combine botany with consent, right? Which is so cool, right? That's and I think that lesson is equally applicable to what we do, like for adults, totally. Putting it in the framework of dealing with children or a children's game, I think is it's important, but not essential, right? Like the stuff that we're doing for other adults is going to benefit.
There are far too many adults who still need the lessons that we teach to children these days. And I'm not going to say I'm not one of them.
So, Jason, you were actually one of the people who has been most influential on me in terms of becoming interested in this topic in the first place. I'm curious to hear about, like, what games have you been working on recently? Like what tech have you been playing around with in your game design recently for kind of addressing nonviolent game design that interests you right now?
Thanks for asking, and I'm glad that I was an influence. That's cool. So I think about this. When I approach a project, I really want to let the project tell me what it wants to be. And sometimes what it wants to be is a completely gnarly game about survival cannibalism, right? And it's going to be a game that foregrounds horrific violence. And that's what it is. And it has other inflection points and nuances and meanings, but like I'm not going to take the violence out of that game because that's the game it wants to be. But that's a question to ask, and I think in many cases the inclusion of violence, or even the inclusion of conflict, is reflexive. And what I would argue is that as designers, we should take a step back and make that one of the questions we ask about a project, and sort of have a conversation with the project as it develops and interrogate that. Is this a game about conflict? Often it is, because conflict is super fun. But not necessarily. Is this a game? If it is about conflict, does that conflict include violence? Often it does, because violence is rad. But it's got to be appropriate, and it has to have boundaries, and it needs to be a good fit for what you're trying to design. So, like recently, I made a game called Space Post, And Space Post very deliberately is not about violence, and it's very little about conflict. And it gets around that by giving you tasks to do, right? You've got these interesting things happening, and it becomes a game that's about managing uncertainty, and it's about discovery and delight, just in the same way that Dungeons and Dragons is. D&D is all those things, but it turns the dial way down. You're just playing a space postman, and so there's no room for violence in the game. It just doesn't. You're a postman. You're a letter carrier. Why would you? In what circumstance are you going to be in a life and death fight? It's just not going to happen. So like in that case, that's what the design told me, and I think that was a good choice. That's an example. I could give others, but I think that's a good one.
One of the things I actually recently played a game of Space Post, and it was great. And one of the things I was a fan of is somewhere in the instructions, either in the game or maybe just hearing you talk about it, I remember you saying, like, always make the stakes smaller. And I think I'm a big fan of, like, that kind of meta instruction to the players about what the story is going to be. I think in the beginning of my design life, I didn't want to railroad my players, and now I'm just becoming a really big fan of like the game I'm designing right now, Our Traveling Home, which is about queer wizard romance and found family. Like, I just straight up say at the beginning of the game, this game's going to have a happy ending, and at the end of the game, these two playbooks are going to have a happy and successful queer romance. Like,
yeah, that's wonderful.
Nobody's going to get fridged. Everyone survives, and like everyone has a happy and functional family at the end of it. Because
good for you.
I think it kind of gets a bad name, but I think there's a lot of utility as designers for just straight up telling people, this is, being explicit about what's on the tin and saying, like, this is what this game does, and if that's not your jam, cool. Bye.
Go play something else.
Well, no, I mean, you can use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail, but I wouldn't advise it. So there's no, when you make a tool, it'll have an intention.
Mm-hmm.
So
sorry.
Please.
Yeah, Ash, what you were saying, I'm such a big fan, not just in games, like in life, of like telling people what I'm looking at and what I think I'm seeing. Like that comes directly from instruction. A lot of how I facilitate, design games, and just interact in the game space is like heavily influenced by like group management and educational practice from my work, and like telling a kid, like, yeah, we're gonna play a game about plants, and it's gonna fucking rule. Maybe not. I'm sorry, I swore, but it's just gonna be really awesome. I forget that I can't do that on streaming. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of power in that too, because it's collaborative power, right? It's a field that you open up to let people join you if they want to, and again, if they don't want to, they can just opt out. And that's really.
And also, I imagine there's a fair amount of satisfaction when you tell someone this is a game about plants, and they don't believe you, and at the end of it, they're like, "This is the best thing ever."
That's cool. Yeah, and Jason, what you were saying about conflict being like enticing, I think that there's a way that you can also frame conflict not necessarily as adversarial between like person to person or character to character, but also just like situationally. And I'd love to talk about one of my games that I think does that, but I want to give other people a chance to say other things they might want to first.
I was going to say the same thing, because that's something you're really good at, right?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're the game designer, so please, I want to hear more, especially if there are plants involved.
There are, sort of. Let's see. The first game that I wrote where I looked at it and I was like, I am really proud of this, was a game for 2 players called Your Dead Friend. it's a little real. I'll just tell people right now, it deals with death and mortality and like a lot of rumination on it. The premise is that there's two characters. One is called the dreamer in the text, and they are aware of what's happening around them, which is that their friend is going to die the next day. But you've somehow been caught in this loop. You don't know, like it's never explicit in the text for a reason, whether it's like a dream or a time loop or whatever. But you know that no matter what happens, the day after today, your friend is going to die. And you just keep coming back to this one day. And the game takes place over taking a walk with your friend and your last conversation with them. Game ends when you tell your friend that you love them. And there's a lot of mechanics for like calibration, being able to take a step back and actually also rewind the clock and even like reset the time loop. Basically, if you try to warn your friend or stop that from happening, the player playing the friend will say like pause, and then there's a mechanic to basically rewind. There's like a trigger sentence. Like I think when I play tested it, I was the friend, and it was, I think there's something stuck in my shoe. And we ended up rewinding like 2 or 3 times, and each time it was like really intense and very emotional. It's 2 players, so you would think a central like tension would be between the 2 of them, right? Like the 2 of them butting heads somehow, but it's really not. It's a connective game. And the tension and conflict is around like inevitability. It's around mortality. And I wasn't necessarily thinking about these things very explicitly while I was writing the game. I was just thinking like, what would be a granular, interesting way to get people to be really present, like 100% present in whatever moment that they're playing, in a way where they can notice the outdoors, because I envisioned this game always happening outside, always happening on a walk. And I think there's something in the text about like, if you're at a loss for what to talk about, like notice a tree, notice a bird, talk about what the weather is like, something like that, something to ground you physically in the natural world or the outside world. I love this game. Which feels funny to say about something I wrote, but I really do, because it's short, it's straightforward, and it's so loaded that there's no combat and there's no fighting or conflict between the 2 people. And I think it's a pretty straightforward illustration of, if you want to design things that get away from the idea of violence as a prime source of adventure or excitement or whatever, there are ways that you can literally pit yourself against circumstance that don't have to be, you know, the way that we've been raised to think. And I think that having more games out there is really a good thing for the industry as well.
Yeah, especially games that are more improv theater than they are, you know, winning or losing period.
Something I wanted to say about your dead friend, Jeeyon, that I think is a really good lesson to take away as a designer, is that when you put in those sort of guardrails, when you say, if this is happening, then do this, you're really priming play, right? You're priming the players about what you expect as a game designer for the experience to be like. So you had a choice there. The choice could have been, I don't even talk about it, just do whatever. If it's awkward, it's awkward. Or you could say, if there's a silence and you need something to talk about your cars, right? Or talk about what's happening in politics. But you choose very deliberately to say, talk about the natural world, which is priming players to play the game that you want them to play, even if they don't have to use that. And I think that's an important point. And in Space Post, I do the same thing. There are long pick lists, and no matter what you pick, you've had to look at my list. And my list is telling you what the game's about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing, and this kind of returns to something that you said, Jeeyon, at the beginning, is we're used to thinking of conflict as being, you know, we're used to thinking of conflict as being necessary to tell an interesting story. And my current game is explicitly, you know, influenced by stuff that doesn't follow that. There's an entire Japanese genre of cinema, you know, I'm thinking Studio Ghibli movies, where, you know, like there's no discernible conflict, and they're still great and super compelling. So I think that's also a good thing to keep in mind, is that definitely as English speaking North American game designers were also influenced by that cultural tradition that kind of says that anything that doesn't have conflict isn't interesting. But I think Your Good Friend is a super interesting example that kind of puts the lie to that. And it's something I'm exploring with our traveling home, which I feel is important to acknowledge. Is 50% a hack of Stewpot by Takuma Akata, which is a game about former fantasy adventurers starting and running a tavern. It's so great. I cannot say enough good things about that game. But there's things where you do weird chores, like wizard chores. What do wizard chores look like? And it in my game that I'm creating, and it's great. Like I've run it several times, and every time, like, that's one of the ones that people are like excited to do, and everyone has fun.
Can I ask you a question? So Ash, you've played with me. You know that I'm always looking for trouble, right? I really want to.
Yes.
I want to knock over the apple cart when I play.
Yes, you do.
And I'm respectful of making sure that the game's intention matches my intention. I'm not going to play a game and make it not fun for people, but I'm always going to look for that. So if I'm playing You're Traveling Home, and that's my impulse, what happens? Can I mess stuff up? Can I create conflicts? And if so, does it derail the game?
I mean, I'm the sort of person where I'm interested in having the low stakes, wholesome moments interspersed with moments of personal tension, because I find that often those moments of personal tension are how you can create personal growth, especially if you are intentional and explicit about it. So, I mean, definitely you wouldn't break Our Traveling Home specifically. I mean, there's a character actually that you probably would greatly enjoy, who's the monster, who used to be, either a demon or a witch or a wizard who used their magic to hurt people, and now is completely powerless and is just a dude,
That's so my jam.
Yeah. And they have to come to terms with, the fact that they use their tremendous power to hurt people and learn how to, actually form attachments to people. So, but, because of who they used to be, they're definitely still going to be kind of a dick, especially at the beginning. So, yeah, that totally, at least for that game specifically. And I think it's helpful to be mindful of the fact that a lot of people do enjoy playing that way, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong. Yeah, especially if you've always been super respectful about it, and I've always enjoyed playing games with you. So.
Oh yeah, I would hope. Something else I wanted to point out, and Mike, this might be relevant to you, but I find that my nephews are the most bloodthirsty, craven, vicious people in the world, and that if you give them those tools, that they will use them.
I believe me, that was, and not to be stereotypical behavior, as I said, it's my friend's daughter. Most of her friends are girls, and I've heard horror stories. I used to play the Living Greyhawk organized play, back when Living Greyhawk was a thing, and the most bloodthirsty tables I ever did were like families, where it was like a mom and daughters. It was great. Don't get me wrong. It was just wonderful to say that, beyond gender, we are still human, and you still want to. Some people just want to whomp on orcs and things, but that's a different panel. But you bring up an interesting. There was the last game I ran for them. I specifically put in an encounter that was intended to be more cartoonish and funky. They were basically on a field trip. They're students at a school for magicians, because the daughter loves Harry Potter, and I'm like, that'll get her involved. And the kids had gotten separated from the parents, and they were walking through the woods, and they found a glade with glowing mushrooms. And so the kids were trying to approach the mushrooms, and of course there were pixies and brownies who were playing tricks on them. And at one point, one of the players had the choice of either hitting the Fey brownie over the head and stealing the mushrooms, or cooking the mushrooms, and if he did a good enough job cooking them, they would give him the mushrooms. So he had an internal. I didn't tell him which one was the right choice, and he made what I thought was the right choice. And I should also footnote that his character, he'd never played any role-playing games before, and I asked him what kind of character he liked in media to model a character, and he loves Gordon Ramsay. So he was playing a barbarian Gordon Ramsay.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And completely on his own, he said, I could poison the mushrooms or spray. He had wanted bug spray because he doesn't like bugs. So he's like, I got bug spray. He's like, I'll cook the mushrooms instead of poisoning them with the bug spray. And he rolled well enough on his whatever roll. I don't know what the heck skill I used, but he made the right choice on his own, and everyone had a lot of fun. It was funny, and also, if he had poisoned all the things, he wouldn't have gotten the clue that led them to the next encounter. So he made the right choice. So hopefully subconsciously he'll know cook the mushrooms.
Ash, do you think we should take some questions?
Yeah, that could be a good idea. We've got a moderator looking at questions for us.
Hello, the first question we got is from Genesis of Legend, which is, what are some of the challenges associated with the traditional social combat mechanisms that use emotional or social violence as the resolution mechanism?
That is a solid question, Jason.
Yeah. Well, if I could just put in just my 2 cents worth on that, I think one of the reasons, as I think I may have mentioned briefly before, one of the reasons that combat has always been a focus of role-playing games is because it's easiest to quantify. You will get a good sense of hit points are a good representation of how beat up you are, but we don't necessarily have a good sense in the social, in your mental aspect, except for things like magic points, but that's not quite the same thing.
I'd love to know, with the phrasing of this question, like when it says, what are some of the challenges associated, whether they mean, whether Pete means designing those games or using extant systems or what. But I did immediately think of trash pile. I don't know if you want to talk about it too a little, Jason, but we, the two of us, made 6 very short games where the main mechanic is picking up trash, and because you can't exactly fight, you can't fight. Why would you fight when you're picking up trash? In real life, that's a bad idea. So all of the tension is social, and I actually, I don't know if I mentioned, I play tested this game recently, social distanced with some friends, and it worked out really well because you don't really want to get super close to each other if you have trash anyway. We had those cool reacher grabbers, and it was awesome. And I did notice, though, that the tension felt very high, and there was a clear system of mechanics around it, and people had a very satisfying time. I don't know if it's a replacement for other systems that have tables and charts that show you exactly how hurt you got. I think those are 2 different styles of play. And so if you're talking about how do you address challenges, I think you need to define the technical framework that you're looking at a little bit more before you can talk about it in more depth.
I think decades of, especially not to knock trad gaming, but this is where I see it happening the most, definitely does prime players to view social interaction through that combat lens, and it can lead to outcomes like, when I first started gaming, the first game that I played was a vampire LARP, and yeah, look, man.
No. I've known a lot of people who played vampire. I know. I can read your mind, and I don't mean that in any bad way.
When you view social interaction through that same, zero-sum combat kind of lens, it can be real bad for issues of consent. I had a situation where I had a character get manipulated into being in a hot tub with someone when I didn't want that situation, because I lost 13 social challenges in a row. And it never occurred to me that I had the option of just saying, like, look, man, I'm not doing this. But I was this 19-year-old woman appearing person at a vampire LARP. So I was like, okay, I guess this is what's happening. Which is why I am much more a fan now of, when I design for personal conflict in games, like putting parameters on it. In the Watch, there's explicitly a move called Resist the Shadow, where if anyone does anything, toxic or intentionally harmful, where the rules kick in and even other players can call you on it, and basically you hit pause and you have a conversation about it, and then some rules kick in. So yeah, I mean, at the very least, that social combat kind of thinking, like approach to how to design for personal conflict, it can be real bad for consent, at the very least.
I think that's a really good point. And I guess from my point of view, it's again a situation where you need to question your assumptions, right? It's a kind of violence, it's a kind of projection of power. Is it any different from stabbing somebody in the face? Maybe not. Like if you're playing Fate, it's not any different. It's exactly the same, and that's a choice that the designers made. So I think that there are many solutions, but they all involve thinking about it rather than making a reflexive choice based on what everybody's doing.
I think there's also, I don't know, in the panel description even, there's sort of like two different arenas that overlap quite a lot, but there's how do you decenter violence in games as a player, and then there's how do you decenter violence in games as a designer. And, as a designer, it's about how do you create a system where if violence is present, it's not the only or central option in resolving a conflict or making a story juicier. And as a player, like I'm kind of like you, Jason. I actually also really love rocking the boat when I'm gaming as a character. Like I love pushing. My favorite tabletop system is Monster Hearts, right? Which I think is self-explanatory for people who use the system.
I have heard of it. I have a good friend who had been away from role-playing games for literally decades, and he just when Monster Hearts, he plays Monster Hearts more intensely than we played D&D in high school. That's how much he loves Monster Hearts.
That's awesome. Yeah,
it's an intense game because a teenager is intense. But like also with my teaching background, like I'm kind of like so many things that you've said, Ash, are very resonant and you as well, Mike, because like I really just don't want to push past anyone's boundaries, and I need a framework to know if in character it's okay to make the other character upset. And there are a lot of systems that like have these gorgeous carrots dangled in front of me of like a cool conflict scene or dramatic scene, but without that scaffolding for like, is this cool with the actual person who's like in the virtual or literal room with me? I'm just gonna default to not doing it, even though that's like not, the exciting choice. And so I think as designers and players, we can both be looking at the same thing and have like very similar hesitations coming from both perspectives. And so I think design has been, and going forward will, like sort of address that focal point a lot more of like, how do we create scaffolds where if violence is a narrative choice that you want to make, how is it both a conscious, deliberate choice, and also how do players communicate with each other, diegetically or not, that it's a cool choice for both of them that will be mutually satisfying.
And this leads to a whole discussion about safety and consent, really, which is for another time, I think.
That's a completely different can of worms. The one area that me as not really a designer like you guys people are, is because when you do home games, regardless of the system that you use, you presumably will know the people, so you will have a sense, even if you don't explicate boundaries, you know your players and the players know you, so you know how far you can get. You as designers writing something that you will be played by people that you don't know, you don't have that luxury. So,
Mhm.
you know, in that sense, you have my utter admiration, because that's why
Yeah.
you guys are designers, and that's why you guys are pros, and I'm just an amateur.
Take another
But
question.
I mean, yeah, let's do another question.
All right, we have one here from B Smirched. How much of player need for conflict is about seeking violence versus seeking competition or otherwise?
Sorry, Laura, could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. I just lost it.
Sorry.
That's it. Oh, I accidentally deleted it when I said it. How much of player need for conflict is about seeking violence versus seeking competition?
Oh.
I mean, my gut reaction to that is that a lot of players are just used to seeing competition through the lens of violence, because that's how culturally it's presented in, you know, movies and stories and media, and just how we think about things. So my gut reaction to that is that a lot of people maybe aren't even consciously aware of that association, and that's you know, why conversations like this are good, so that people can, you know, kind of decouple that automatic association and say, well, you know, maybe what I want is competition, but I don't want, you know, violence to come out of it. If that makes sense.
No, I mean, that's why I had said I've in my mind I decoupled violence from combat, because combat implies that there are rules and a framework, whereas violence is just hitting someone. If that makes any sense. Like, boxing is violent, but it's also combat, whereas I hit a guy, that's just violence. That's not boxing. A subtle difference, but again, that's just me thinking out loud.
There are also rule sets where violence is competition, and
Yes.
competition is violence, and the two are conflated, and they're sort of a monolithic option quite often.
It also gets to the kind of games that people are drawn to play.
Sure. I feel like maybe that's a question that we can talk about more after the panel.
Yes.
Maybe get some more clarity on where that's coming from.
Yeah. So could we get another question?
Yeah, here's a more specific one, perhaps, from Dino Corgi. Speaking more on the design end of things, do you find it easier to design resolution mechanics about specific actions, jump, persuade, cast a spell, or general action areas, like mental, social, technological? I'm sorry, I left myself on mute. I do this every day of my life.
We heard you.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
did hear you.
We're
I
all
muted myself
thinking,
afterwards.
we're all
we-
thinking really hard about Dino Corgi's question.
We'll find it in the chat because I didn't hear you, but I know that we're running out of time.
Well, okay. So just brief. I'll answer that very briefly. I prefer things to be as broad and open-ended as possible. Just as a preference, I trust the people that are playing my games, and I want them to be able to make interesting choices because they're smarter than I am.
Okay, yeah, I found this specific phrasing. I think I agree with you. I prefer to write games where I feel like I can trust players even if I'm not in the room with them, because I don't want to be in the room with every single person who's ever playing a game I've written. That's impossible. And I also like feeling like people are autonomous and can calibrate themselves in their own groups. Also, I don't think I've ever designed a game that's like jump this many points or like swing this many or like whatever, because I have a really hard time parsing those systems as a player. It's only very recently that I started playing D&D, for example, and it's because I have my friend is DMing the game and he's like, I love numbers and I will do it all for you. And I'm like, great. That's what I want. So like I find those systems honestly kind of not alienating, but it's an immediate opt-out for me because it's stressful. because I just don't have a great head for math or short-term memory. So when I design, it's usually out of what I like and what I find comfortable, which means I rarely use those very granular mechanics.
Yeah, I be honest, the simplicity of the math of 5th edition of D&D is what led me to do it rather than Pathfinder.
I mean, you know, my answer is very much biased by the fact that I design LARPs and you know, when I design tabletops, I design for Powered by the Apocalypse specifically because what interests me isn't the, you know, how well do you jump? It's what happens when you jump. If you jump off a building, do you know, how well does that go for you? What are the outcomes? But also, yeah, I mean, definitely what Jason said about, you know, I'd rather trust my players. I think there is a phase of playtesting that is very important where can you get the players to understand what the game is and what it's supposed to do? And once you've gotten to that point, then just leave it in the players' hands and let them do what they need to do with the rules.
Yeah.
How about another question?
All right, this one's from Clark Valentine. Part of the fun of in-game conflict and violence for my players is about taking risk, making tactical decisions, and creating uncertain and unexpected outcomes. What RPGs do you think do a good job providing that without centering violence? And I'll throw on from the chat that looks like some people are very interested in things that are designed for campaigns as opposed to just one-shots.
Clark, that's a great, super good question. I just wanted to throw that out there. Please go ahead and answer.
I'm gonna name check Jason. I think Night Witches is a great long form game for that. And I'm gonna name check myself a little bit, but you know, The Watch is also a game explicitly about fighting a military campaign against an oppressive evil force. But I stole all the good stuff from Jason, so at least in terms of modeling the military campaign. So yeah, I mean, those are both, you know, both Night Witches and The Watch are games that are kind of about violence, but also not, in that they're really not, you know, designed to model interpersonal conflict outside of the, you know, fighting on the battlefield. It's more about those personal connections. So I think there's definitely ways to still have, you know, stories about fighting and tactics and strategy, but like also very much intentionally center like personal relationships and interpersonal dynamics.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And like if you're playing Night Witches right, every night it's just a sort of series of die rolls that create a narrative, and then you're back to the game. You're not really focused on the horrific total war part of it as much as you're focused on the other more interesting stuff. The other answer, I think, to Clark's question is to play a game that's more sort of more wide open in terms of theme and tone, and then agree as players to do that. So my go-to game is Archipelago, but there are many systems that would accommodate that really well. If as a group you just had a social contract that said that's what we want. We're interested in super interesting dynamic situations, lots of uncertainty, discovery, surprise, danger, but we're not interested in fighting.
I think this again gets back to kind of like, how does this panel address questions that come up as a player versus as a designer, right? Because like as a designer, you can't really design for strong rapport unless, again, it's like that's the thing you say is like intrinsic to the mechanics, which some of my games actually do. But as a player, you could take any system and be like, we're going to roll with this in our own way, but no fighting, right? Or whatever.
I'm sorry I have to say this because it's such a perfect segue. Our friend Steve Seghetti last night said, "Yeah, I made up a new D&D character last night. He's a Knoll detective," and I was like, "You are swimming upstream, buddy. Swimming upstream."
I
loved it.
Oh my god, I want to watch Steve play that.
I mean, you know, in the game in the game that I run for my friends, the principal of the school is really a gold dragon. The assistant principal is a Medusa who is trying to reform, and she's a veterinarian. And
awkward.
They have, well, no, it's actually very cool because, you know, it gives me a whole bunch of opt-ins for this. The principal has hooks for the for my friend's daughter, who is a sorcerer with dragon blood. Having, I have long wanted, ever since I read the game Blue Planet, which is a game that is like the Hamlet of role-playing games for me, because it is such a broadly, conceptually wonderful game that there's no way to summarize. It has a very strong ecological component, and one of the things that you can, with that game, go out and do is go out and just find weird creatures on this planet. And I brought that into my game, and that's why I have a Medusa as a veterinarian. She's the scary assistant principal in the school. It's worked very well.
Do we want to try and answer one more question super quick before we pimp ourselves and where we can find our stuff? Because that is also important.
All right, from Zen Barrel Maker. Is conflict synonymous with challenge? What would collective challenge mechanics look like if violence wasn't available as a resolution pathway?
Oh, God, I hate name checking myself, but I'm going to do it. So I don't think...
Go for it. You know your own stuff best.
I don't think conflict is synonymous with... collective conflict is select... I don't think they're the same. And in our traveling home, I explicitly have mini games where characters come together to do things like improve the house, or recover from a disastrous situation, or just do wizard chores. And they're inherently not conflict based, but they require working together. And having moments of personal connection, and things can go badly. You can get a symbol wrong and blow up all the windows, and then have to spend your afternoon sweeping up glass, or irritating things like that, right? So there's still things that can go wrong that are interesting, but they're still not about conflict. So you can, and that's not to say that collective challenge as conflict is bad. It still can be interesting, but they don't have to be the same.
Yeah, I don't think, I absolutely agree. Conflict is 100% not synonymous with challenge for me. I know we're coming up on time, so I'll try to be short, but puzzles are challenge, emotional quandaries are challenge. It's so, challenge is like such a huge umbrella, and conflict is just one small piece of a very large pie. We can eat the rest of that pie. There's a lot of options out there.
We can talk about it more after the panel wraps too.
Yeah, for sure. Real quick, where can people find you and give you money?
I'll go first. You can find me at bullypulpitgames.com or on Twitter at bullypulpit_HQ.
Awesome. You can find me on Twitter at WonderGeek. My role-playing games are peachpantspress.com, and the game that I have been referencing repeatedly, Our Traveling Home, hopefully coming to Kickstarter in February 2021.
Yay.
You can find me on Twitter at twitter.com, and then my name, which is on all of my handles and also right here on Discord and on Twitch. My Patreon is also under my name. And the games I referenced, Your Dead Friend, is on my itch.io store, also at my name. I got that SEO on lock. On Twitter, I often talk about stuff in development, and my Patreon is also increasingly my storefront, so a lot of stuff will be more available there. And the collaborative game that I referenced, Trash Play, is, I believe, on Bully Pulpit's Patreon, which is excellent, and one of 2 Patreons I subscribe to. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm just real quick. I'm on Facebook as Mike Czaplinski. Currently, my avatar is me dressed as Danger Mouse, circa 1985. And I'm actually going to promote some things by a friend of mine that I think are excellent, non-violent uses of the D&D 5th edition rulesbook. Her name is Judy Black. You can find her on DM's Guild. The 2 ones in particular are something called Arcana Depot, which is a bunch of magic shops where you can go in and interact with the shop owners and get cool magic stuff, and Arcana Games, which is a magical fun fair, and it's a magical amusement park, or a magical arcade games you can use in your campaign. They are very. She also does an excellent thing called Swordbreaker Mine, which has the coolest map I have ever seen. And that's all I'll say. Look for Judy Black on DM's Guild. They're all PDFs. They're all worth it at 3 times the price she charges. So,
Well, this has been great.
Thank you all for letting me
really
sit in with y'all.
It was so good to meet you,
Same
Mike.
here.
And Ash, it was so good to see your face on my computer screen. It's been a while.
Yes.
It's nice to see all of you.
Always good to see you, Jason. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And
Yes.
thank you for organizing this.